Eddard Stark stood upon the ramparts of Winterfell, the chill wind whispering across the battlements in a hush that set his very bones to shuddering. He was newly returned from the war. Robert Baratheon's rebellion was won, and the Dragon Kings of House Targaryen were shattered. The days of ice and steel, of blood and fire, had wrought a kind of victory for the usurper and for the North. Yet peace tasted bitter on Ned's tongue. That day, beneath the dull sky of the North, the first threads of a doom he could not name began to weave themselves around his destiny. He felt it as a breath on the back of his neck, an exhalation of hoarfrost that he half imagined. Grey Wind, the direwolf pup who had shadowed him since the war, let out a low, uneasy growl. The wind changed direction, and Eddard caught the faintest echo of cold voices so far away they might have come from beyond the wall, or deeper still, in the realms of ancient nightmares. He shook off his dread, forcing himself to dwell on the living. Wounds still bled across the kingdom, even if Robert sat on the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn was the new hand, and Ned was content to nurse the North back to health, or so he told himself. His older brother Brandon was gone. His father Rickard had been lost to Aerys Targaryen's flames, and Lyanna lay in her grave. Responsibilities weighed heavily on the new Lord Stark's shoulders. He told himself that quiet duty was his path, but he could not shake the memory of a fresh snowfall blanketing the Red Keep in his dream last night. The wind moaned with too much familiarity. A flicker of panic seized his chest. He gazed over his fortress walls into the haze of white skies, and he found himself whispering a prayer to the old gods. Perhaps it was only old grief stirring anew. The days passed into weeks, and Eddard's household settled into a semblance of peace. He took comfort in his wife, Catelyn Tully, and in the children that soon came, Robb's first stumbling steps, Sansa's bright eyes, and the promise of more to come. His heart warmed at the patter of small feet in Winterfell's halls. But the North, as if haunted by the very memory of winter, refused to let him rest. Whispers flitted in the great yard. A wildling raiding party had been spotted near the Shadow Tower. A man had disappeared beyond the Long Lake. Strange sightings near the abandoned Night Fort. The stories came and went, the sort one heard every season, but Eddard felt an urgency. The nights stretched, and the wind from the wall carried foreboding, or so he imagined. Whenever the strange sense of dread grew too powerful, he walked the crypts beneath Winterfell, searching for guidance in the shadows of his ancestors. The statues of old Lord Stark seemed to stare back with silent disapproval. Yet the quiet gave him no clarity, only deeper questions. Tales of the others remained bedtime stories in the minds of most. Yet one crisp morning, a raven arrived from the Old Bear, Lord Commander Jeor Mormont of the Night's Watch. The message was terse. The Watch had found bodies near the Frostfangs, rangers slaughtered in a way that defied understanding. Each was pale as the snow, limbs contorted, eyes wide with terror. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of mortal weapons. Some of the men claimed the others were stirring, that a cold power was at work. Mormont had little time for superstition, but he was no fool. He warned that ill omens abounded in the far north, and he asked for extra supplies, men if possible, or at least a Stark's ear. Eddard struggled with the decision. He remembered all too well the sacrificial role the Night's Watch played at the margin of the realm. They were protectors, sworn brothers. He'd heard the terrifying legends of the Long Night, but they had always seemed so distant. The White Walkers, the Night King, the betrayal of the Watch myths from the Age of Heroes. Still, the letter weighed on him, and the sense of an unseen presence tugged at his mind. When he closed his eyes, he envisioned pale shapes moving through moonlit forests. Here's the crackle of ice under footsteps too silent to be quite human. In the end, he decided to ride to the wall himself. He trusted Mormont and feared that if the North ignored the pleas of the Watch, some new horror might slip through the cracks of the realm's memory. He left Winterfell under the guardianship of Catelyn, kissing her goodbye in the soft dawn light. Robb clung to his leg, not old enough to fully understand his father's duties, but old enough to sense the sorrow of parting. Sansa cried in the corridor, gently pulled away by Septas. Eddard saddled his horse alongside a small retinue of loyal men, Jory Castle, the loyal Roderick Castle, and a dozen good swords who volunteered for the journey. They carried fresh supplies for Castle Black, hoping that their presence alone might reinvigorate the men of the Watch. Perhaps the old stories were simply that, stories. Perhaps the corpses discovered had been the result of some savage tribe of free folk or a trick of bandits hiding in the wastes. But the pang in Eddard's heart would not still. Their ride to the wall was long but uneventful at first. Narrow roads wound through bleak landscapes, winter-bare trees bent under the wind's lash. They stayed at the last hearth, the seat of House Umber, for 2 days, hearing no new tales beyond the usual. Rare sightings of giants, ephemeral glimpses of strange shapes on the horizon. Great John Umber boasted that any others foolish enough to cross into his domain would get a taste of northern steel. Ned accepted the hospitality, quietly noting the anxiety that flickered in Gretchen's eyes after the boasts were made. The watchmen on the battlements there spoke in hushed tones of nights that felt unnaturally cold, of voices on the wind that didn't belong to mortal throats. By the time Eddard's party left, a tension clung to the air like frost. Each man among them kept a wary eye on the snow-laden trails, as if anticipating a wraith in every patch of shadow. They reached the wall in due course, marveling at the towering barrier of ice that blocked out the sky. Eddard had seen it before, but each time his breath caught. The height, the enormity, the sense of age, these were wonders of the realm. Jeor Mormont greeted him with thanks, though a grimness pressed down on the old Lord Commander's brow. Inside Castle Black's courtyard, Black brothers practiced at arms with a quiet sense of desperation. Even those who had joined the order to escape punishment or poverty seemed shaken. The rumors had spread among them of dead men with blue eyes that glowed like ghostly lanterns. Mormont led Eddard into his solar, where a fire roared, but the room still felt cold. He explained what they had found. The bodies, the impossibility, the swirl of rumors that the culprits were the White Walkers themselves. Men as stoic as Benjen Stark, Ned's own brother, had reported seeing fleeting shapes in the snowy wastes, though they were uncertain. Benjen was absent from Castle Black at that moment, out on a ranging, but Mormont assured Ned that when he returned, he would confirm the stories. Ned's heart tightened. Could the legends be true? He had done his best to hold the North for King Robert, but Robert's interest in the land beyond the Neck was minimal. The new king cared for tournaments and feasts, for the spoils of war and the illusions of stability. The North had been left mostly to fend for itself. Eddard began to wonder if the war for the Iron Throne, so recently concluded, had been but a prelude to a threat far greater than any Targaryen. Questions and doubts pressed in on him. They kept him awake at night in his quarters at Castle Black. The wind around the wall was like a living presence, howling with an unearthly voice. One night, he rose from his bed, unable to sleep, and walked out into the moonlit courtyard. Snow crunched beneath his boots, and the sky was a deep blue vault strewn with cold stars. He thought to climb the wall and gaze beyond, to see if the land itself might provide some clarity. But something tugged at him from the side, movement near the archway leading out to the practice yard. Sword in hand, he moved carefully, half expecting a cloak-shrouded brother out for a midnight stroll. Instead, he felt a presence, like a swirl of cold mist, pass beside him with no sound of footsteps. A single, soft whisper grazed his ear. The voice was delicate, lighter than any breeze. He froze, trying to discern words, but the whisper's meaning slipped away. Alarmed, Eddard tried to follow the presence, but he found nothing but empty corridors and dark archways. He hurried to his chambers, unsettled. Sleep would not come the rest of that night. Dawn found Eddard reluctant to describe what he'd experienced. Mormont was a no-nonsense commander, so the notion of a ghostly voice might strain credulity. Still, Eddard found the courage to confide in him. Mormont listened with gravity. "We have reason to suspect all manner of unnatural things these days," he said, rubbing his beard. "Ned, I'm not a man to put stock in ghost stories, but too many strange happenings have plagued us of late. There's talk among the wildlings of a king in the north, a king of ice, leading them, but I've heard worse. that something older than the wildlings themselves stirs them to fear. Ned tried to press for more details, but Mormont had none. The rumors were contradictory. Some spoke of a power in the lands of always winter. Others told of a white army growing in the far north. All the stories merged into one conclusion. The old evils were waking. Eddard resolved to see for himself. The best chance for truth was to speak with the free folk, or perhaps to range beyond the wall. Mormont, anxious about the precarious state of his garrison, allowed Ned a small escort of black brothers, men who volunteered, including the redoubtable Corran Halfhand from the Shadow Tower. Danger was certain, but if Eddard was determined, the Lord Commander would not stand in his way. Within a day, Eddard set forth with Corran and a handful of rangers. The biting wind lashed at them as they passed through the gates. A bleak swath of pine forests and rocky hills greeted them. The journey beyond the wall felt like stepping into an alien world, vast and unwelcoming, shimmering with untouched snows. The trees stood tall like silent sentinels, dark limbs swaying with hidden warnings. Each night they huddled around meager campfires, speaking little, wary of what prowled the darkness. Ice crystals glittered in the moonlight with an unsettling sheen, as if reflecting otherworldly eyes. At first, they found no immediate sign of the rumored horrors, just endless snowdrifts, the distant howling of wolves, and the occasional glimpse of a free folk hunting party that vanished before confrontation. Yet as they pressed on, Eddard began to sense that the land itself was watching him. One evening, they discovered the remains of a wildling camp. Fires gone cold, tents torn apart, bodies sprawled in the snow. Each corpse wore an expression of unspeakable terror. Their throats were slit open, some limbs severed with an uncanny sharpness. Corran, steel-eyed, knelt by one body, examining the wounds. "No mortal blade did this," he murmured, pointing to edges cut so clean they might have been done by a blade of glass or ice. Eddard struggled not to flinch. He forced himself to close the eyes of a young girl whose skin was white with frost. They followed a trail northward for another day, perhaps foolishly, for the rangers themselves were growing uneasy. Finally, at dusk, they caught sight of a figure in the distance. The snow whirled thick, but Ned saw something tall and slender, cloaked in a shimmer of pale light that reflected the dying sun. Corran signaled the group to halt. In the swirling snow, shapes appeared, 3 in total, gliding across the drifts without leaving footprints. When they came closer, Eddard's heart nearly stopped. The shapes were undeniably human-like, but their flesh seemed carved of something akin to ice, their eyes cold flames of blue. In their hands, they carried swords that glimmered with an unearthly sheen. The others, fear surged through Ned like molten lead. He had grown up on Old Nan's stories of these beings, the White Walkers who brought the long night. He had dismissed them as legends, yet here they stood, silent, lethal. Corran drew his steel, but Eddard sensed mortal steel would do little. A primal terror thundered in his veins. The others advanced with eerie grace, mere silhouettes in the thickening swirl of snow. Ned raised his voice. "We mean no." He never finished the sentence. The first other lunged, its sword slicing with impossible speed. One of the rangers, Jeremy, blocked with his own blade, only to see the steel shatter like ice. A shriek tore from his lips as the cold blade of the other sliced through his torso with breathtaking ease. Corran roared, brandishing a dragonglass dagger he'd carried in case the old tales were true. He dived forward, steel in one hand and dragonglass in the other, calling on the old gods. Eddard tried to rally the men, but panic was thick. Another other vanished into a swirl of white, reappearing behind them, taking down a ranger with a silent slash. The cold seemed to intensify, as though each breath was tearing their lungs. Corran managed to plunge the dragonglass dagger into one of the others, and the creature let out an inhuman screech. Its form cracked and collapsed into shards of ice. The success was fleeting. More shapes emerged behind the swirling snow, watching with those glowing eyes. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Eddard's heart pounded. He realized this was no myth. The others were real, and they were not a random threat. They were here, their numbers greater than any man dared imagine. He thought of his children in Winterfell, of the realm oblivious to this danger, and he felt a swell of desperate courage. Qhorin seized Eddard's arm. "Run," he said, pointing southward. "Warn them. The realm must know." Eddard bristled at the idea of abandoning the fight, but he saw the hopelessness in Qhorin's eyes. One of the rangers, a youth named Wick, already lay dying in the snow, face contorted with horror. The others moved with lethal purpose, corralling them away from escape routes. Eddard readied to rally the men for a retreat, but in that instant, a figure emerged from the swirling white, different from the others. This figure was taller, clad in what seemed like black ice that shimmered with an indescribable hue. Its eyes burned a blue so dark it was nearly violet. In its right hand, a blade of pure ice crackled with pale light. Eddard felt a chill in his soul, as though all warmth fled him. This, he realized, might be the true master behind these nightmares. The legends called him the Night King. Silence reigned. Even the wind seemed to hush in the presence of the Night King. Qhorin stared, transfixed. Eddard felt a wave of unearthly terror wash over him, as if the presence of this being was a violation of all that was natural. One of the others advanced, raising its glimmering sword. Qhorin roared a challenge, but the Night King lifted a single hand. Frost spread over the ground in a heartbeat, and Qhorin staggered, his breath turning to ice crystals. In moments, he was on his knees. Eddard gripped the hilt of his sword, knowing it would do no good, but in reflex he tried to fight. The blade froze to his hand, the metal turning brittle. He heard the crack of steel. Another wave of cold hammered him, and the breath seized in his chest. He dropped to one knee as his vision danced with white spots. Time seemed to slow. Eddard felt an unearthly presence press into his mind, a cold whisper snaking through his thoughts. He tried to resist, clinging to the memory of his family, of his duties. But the whisper was more insistent than any mortal voice. It conveyed a sense of boundless age, a domain older than men, older than the first men. Through the haze, Eddard glimpsed the Night King's face. Whatever semblance of flesh it had was touched by an inhuman stillness. Those dark blue eyes peered into Ned's very soul, and in that moment, Eddard heard a voice within him. Serve or die. A swirl of ice parted them. The others closed in, forming a ring. Eddard tried to rise, but his body was half frozen. He saw Qhorin slump to the snow, eyes rolling back. Two others seized him and dragged him away. The remaining rangers were either dead or dying. The wind moaned like a dirge. The Night King stepped closer, sword at Eddard's throat. Frost rimed Ned's beard, and he felt his consciousness waver, pinned by that inhuman gaze. Then, without any warning, a vast darkness swept over him, as though the entire night sky had been poured into his senses. He collapsed. He awoke in a place of swirling snow, pinned to a bizarre dais of frost and black ice. Whether it was a cavern or an open field under a starless sky, he could not tell. Everything glimmered in an endless expanse of white and black, shapes shifting at the periphery. He heard soft, distant screams, recognized Qhorin's voice among them. Then everything subsided into hush. A single being approached, tall, emanating that dreadful aura. The Night King. Eddard summoned all his courage and spat a defiance, though his words emerged in a hoarse whisper. Kill me, then. I won't be your thrall. But the Night King's voice, if it was a voice, spoke into Eddard's mind, not his ears. Kill? Thrall? The infinite frost pressed inward, and Eddard felt fear beyond reason. Yet the presence hammered on, imprinting images of eons past, of a world blanketed by unending winter, of the first men forging alliances with the children of the forest, and of a terrible betrayal that shaped the Night's Watch in an age so distant that legend blurred with fact. The Night King's eyes held him in thrall. Eddard saw glimpses of an ancient sorrow, an ancient rage, betrayal, fear, vengeance. These were the emotions swirling in that cold, inhuman heart. The presence did not want to kill him. That much Eddard understood. It wanted an ally, a wedge into the realm of men. The image of a direwolf crowned with ice flashed before Eddard's eyes, and he understood. This being sought to claim the North by corrupting its greatest symbol. It sought the loyalty of the Stark name. Eddard gasped. He tried to muster words, but the cold pressed on his skull. Then the ultimatum came again, not in speech but in sensation. A burning cold that threatened to tear him to pieces unless he yielded. It was no simple matter of bribes or threats. This was a supernatural force that could force a man's soul to kneel. In a final, desperate spark of defiance, Eddard pictured his children's faces, his wife, his sense of honor. If he gave in, he would become a monster. If he did not, all he loved might perish. He felt the Night King's unstoppable might. The others could march south eventually, unstoppable as winter itself. Perhaps there was a chance, a sliver of hope, that by pretending to serve, Eddard could protect his family. Perhaps he could find a way to sabotage this ancient evil from within. The decision ripped at him like jagged ice, but in the end, with tears freezing on his cheeks, Eddard Stark bowed his head. The presence withdrew momentarily, and Eddard collapsed, free of the dais but chained in mind. He lay, panting, in the snow, hearing the Night King's silent satisfaction. Something cold slid across his brow, a brand of ice. A searing agony whipped through him as if his very blood were turning to frost. He let out a hoarse scream. Then it was done. He was bound. The vow he had taken to Robert Baratheon, to the realm, to the living, was overshadowed by a vow forged in the deep magic of the OT. Hers. The snow parted, and Eddard glimpsed Corrin's body, splayed and motionless, half encased in rime. The rest of the Rangers were nowhere to be seen. Ned shuddered, tears streaming. This was the cost of his vow. He mustered enough energy to stand, trembling on numb legs. The Night King gestured, and an other approached, sword at the ready. Eddard steeled himself, expecting death, but instead the other flicked its blade with a chilling hiss. A swirl of wind rose, whirling around Ned, enveloping him in a biting cold that left him on the edge of oblivion. Time lost all meaning. When the wind died, the dais was gone, replaced by the endless snowy wilderness. The others had vanished. Eddard stood alone in that alien expanse, uncertain where he was or how far from the wall. Something new slithered within him, a chill undercurrent that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The vow to the Night King was carved into his spirit. In that vow, he sensed a silent directive. Return to Winterfell. Prepare. Serve. Days or weeks might have passed in a haze. Eddard stumbled through the wastes, ironically sustained by the very power that had enslaved him. He did not starve, did not freeze, though he barely slept. Memories blurred. At times, he collapsed in the snow, sure death would take him, only to rise again under that silent compulsion. The skies were gray and silver, the sun pale. Eventually, by unimaginable fortune or by the Night King's design, he saw the wall's colossal outline. He had circled somehow to the west, near the Shadow Tower. The Black Brothers on watch cried out when they saw him, half dead and stumbling. They rushed to rescue him. He felt the faintest relief, but also the unholy weight of the secret he now carried. They took him into the warmth of the Shadow Tower's hall, stripped his frostbitten clothes, and pressed him with hot mulled wine. Their maester fussed and prayed, amazed that Eddard lived at all. He asked about the other Rangers. Eddard, trembling, said only that they'd encountered foes beyond imagining, that the rest of the men were lost. The Watchers were horrified. Rumors spread among the brothers. It was said Ned Stark had confronted the others themselves. In delirium, Eddard might have confirmed that, but he never spoke the name Night King. He could not. Something in him forbade it, as if the vow had sealed his tongue. Eventually, he recovered enough to travel south, escorted by Black Brothers who insisted he rest at Castle Black first. But Eddard refused, pressing to return to Winterfell. Fear for his family gnawed at him, and he needed to conceal the truth of his bondage. If Mormont or any other discovered that he was enthralled, they would imprison him or worse. Perhaps he deserved as much, but the vow within his mind compelled him onward. For the good of his kin, or so he told himself. The journey was swift, with fresh horses and minimal rest. Eddard's men in Winterfell rejoiced to see their lord alive, though they were shocked by his pallor and gaunt features. Catelyn embraced him in tears. The children clung to him. He offered them a faint, brittle smile, trying to appear as the same Ned they had known. But inside, a new, icy presence lurked. Life in Winterfell resumed its usual rhythms, albeit overshadowed by Ned's changed demeanor. He avoided direct confrontation with anyone. He walked the walls at night, alone, peering north as though expecting the blizzard to roll in at any moment. Maester Luwin noticed the stark shift in his lord's behavior, the quiet brooding. The nightmares that racked Eddard left him drenched in cold sweat each morning. Or were they nightmares at all? Visions of the others, of the Night King's plan, flickered behind his eyelids. He felt a compulsion to strengthen Winterfell's defenses, to rally the northern lords. Yet simultaneously, an imperative from that vow insisted on weakening the realm, sowing confusion, ensuring the living would not be ready when the dead marched south. The conflict tore at him day by day. He managed to hide the truth, but it eroded his soul. Word reached King's Landing of Eddard's brush with death beyond the wall. Robert Baratheon was enthroned in the Red Keep, hearing news of rebellions, taxes, and petty squabbles. The king was troubled by rumors of White Walkers but dismissed them as fantasy or at best local threats. He summoned Eddard to court, intending to make him Warden of the North officially and reward him for his valor. Eddard nearly declined the summons, but the vow urged him to go. The throne of men was a key target. If the living were united under a strong hand, the coming invasion might face real resistance. The vow compelled Eddard to ensure that did not happen. In the secrecy of his bedchamber, he wept into his hands, realizing the darkness of what he must do. He could not defy the Night King. Already, that presence racked him with mind-numbing cold if he strayed too close to open defiance. So he decided to depart for King's Landing, leaving Catelyn and the children behind. He told them it was his duty. He told himself it was to keep them safe. The real reason lay like a shard of ice in his heart. The realm must remain divided, vulnerable. He was to be the Night King's unwitting agent. The journey south to the capital brought memories of war. The Trident, Harrenhal's looming towers, the scorch marks left by Dragonfire. All reminders of the Targaryen downfall, of the cause for which Ned had fought. Now, ironically, he was an agent for a different conqueror. When he arrived at the Red Keep, Robert greeted him with a booming laugh, embracing him. The king seemed heavier than before, jolly but easily bored by matters of state. Queen Cersei stood at his side, cold-eyed and distant, though she offered Ned a polite smile. The court's opulence clashed with the austere winter Ned carried within him. He did not want to linger in the capital, but the vow insisted he manipulate matters. The Night King, in some dread manner, demanded the infiltration of the seat of power. Days in the Red Keep felt like trudging through a labyrinth. The courtiers were preoccupied with intrigues. Jon Arryn served his hand, diligently managing affairs, but Ned saw cracks forming in the realm's unity. The Tyrells sulked in Highgarden, the Martells simmered with resentment in Dorne, and the Greyjoys still nursed ambition. Some part of Ned recognized that a united realm might have a chance against the threat in the north, but the vow inside him twisted that knowledge into impetus for sabotage, whispering suggestions in the king's ear about the unreliability of certain lords, planting seeds of discord over titles and inheritances. Each small act pained Ned, yet the magical compulsion overshadowed his conscience. He took small solace that outwardly, he maintained an image of unwavering stark honor. No one suspected his internal torment. Still, not all were blind to his changes. Jon Arryn, so perceptive and paternal, took Ned aside more than once. "My Lord Stark," he said in gentle concern, "your face shows more sorrow than a man newly confirmed in his titles. If something troubles you, trust that I would hear it." Ned Torn wished he could confess, but to do so would place Jon in terrible peril. The vow swelled like a hand crushing his throat. Ned forced a hollow smile. "I am only weary from the road," he said. and from the burdens of the north. Jon studied him with sympathetic eyes. He accepted the excuse for the moment, but Ned sensed that the old man was not entirely convinced. Meanwhile, Robert seemed too enamored of feasting and jousting to notice any subtle disquiet in his friend. Weeks passed. The compulsion to undermine the throne grew stronger. Ned found himself orchestrating petty arguments between lords, fueling rumors that House Tyrell might challenge the king's authority if any sign of weakness emerged. He hinted that House Arryn might be too controlling in the finances, fueling resentment from other crown advisors. At times, he despised himself. He thought of his father, Rickard, and how he died for loyalty and honor. He imagined his father's disappointment at seeing him weave lies at court. Sometimes the vow's grip slackened slightly, and Ned wondered if there was a way to break it. He recalled the legends, dragonglass, Valyrian steel, the powers of R'hllor in the Far East. But these were ephemeral solutions. Who in Westeros could free him of this ancient sorcery? His nights were haunted. He slept in the Tower of the Hand as an honored guest, dreaming of a freezing wind raking the Red Keep. He saw the White Walkers drifting through the throne room while Robert's corpse lay slumped over the Iron Throne, icicles spiking from his crown. Then the vision shifted to King's Landing in flames. Only it was not dragonfire but an icy conflagration, swirling with storm winds. He would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Sometimes, just as he woke, he heard the voice in his mind again. Serve. Prepare. Wait. One dawn, a raven arrived for King Robert, bearing grave news from the north. Wildlings were massing in unprecedented numbers near the Milkwater. Hostile movements threatened the wall on multiple fronts. Robert looked to Ned for guidance. Even with the vow, Ned was first to Stark. He felt genuine alarm at the mention of such a gathering, for it might signal the beginning of the Night King's grand design. But how could he counsel Robert? If the realm raised a massive force, it might slow the invasion. The vow demanded that Eddard hamper that possibility. Slowly, carefully, Ned advised caution, suggested the wildling threat was likely exaggerated. He recommended a measured response, a new recruitment drive for the Watch rather than a full-scale mobilization of the realm. Robert, always loath to spend coin or raise troops unless necessary, readily agreed. Jon Arryn looked askance at Ned, somewhat puzzled, but did not press the matter. A few nights later, Ned dreamed of the crypts in Winterfell. He saw his ancestors stirring, the stone statues turning their heads, their eyes dark. A voice echoed in the darkness. "You are no Stark." He woke shouting, tangling in sweat-soaked sheets. The vow's chill curled inside his mind, punishing him for his rebellion of spirit. He pressed a fist to his chest, trying to steady his heart. A plan began to form in the corners of his consciousness. If he could not bring the realm to unite openly, perhaps he could orchestrate a covert alliance. Gather men loyal to him in secret, muster resources in the north. In that way, he might appear to serve the vow but could be forging a hidden blade. The risk was immense, for the vow would sense any direct betrayal. But if he could couch his preparations in half-truths, if he could make it seem like normal feudal politics, he resolved to leave King's Landing soon. He told Robert it was time he returned to the north, that the realm might need him there to keep the wildlings at bay, to watch the wall. Robert grumbled, wanting his friend to remain, but ultimately relented. Ned departed with small fanfare, though Jon Arryn embraced him, telling him to keep in better spirits. He asked Ned to remain watchful of any threat from beyond the wall. Ned nodded, a quiet dread in his eyes. On the road north, Ned traveled with only a handful of retainers. The vow's presence ebbed in that open air, the icy grip diminishing somewhat, though it remained like a splinter in his mind. He stared at the passing fields and forests, imagining them all buried under endless snow, haunted by the wights of his new master. Each night, he turned the situation over in his head, searching for a path to break the vow or to sabotage it. He thought of brandishing dragonglass, but the vow prevented him from acting on any direct harm to the others or the Night King. He realized the vow was cunning. He could not openly rebel, but perhaps in secrecy he could prepare the north. He would strengthen the fortress of Winterfell under the guise of fortifying it for any southern threat. He would quietly encourage northern lords to train their men in forms of combat that might be effective against the others. And he would search for an ally with knowledge of arcane arts who might free him from this curse. In time, he reached Winterfell. The seat of House Stark rose from the snowy landscape, its towers and walls a familiar sight. He dismounted and walked into the courtyard. Robb, now a sturdy boy, ran to greet him, while Sansa, bright-eyed, curtsied. Arya, small and mischievous, peeked out from behind a pillar. Bran was just old enough to toddle after them. Ned knelt, scooping them into his arms, feeling the strain between fatherly love and the monstrous vow. He glanced at Catelyn, who welcomed him with a warm smile, though worry etched her features. In that moment, seeing his family safe, he vowed silently that no matter the cost, he would protect them from the creeping doom he had been forced to serve. The weeks that followed saw a transformation in Winterfell. Ned called his bannermen for a meeting. He spoke of possible dangers from House Greyjoy or from a resurgence of Targaryen loyalists. He invoked the importance of forging stronger militia forces in the north. Many of the lords nodded, though some grumbled at the cost. Ned provided coin from the Stark treasury to encourage the training of archers and swordsmen, ensuring an ample supply of spears and bows. He quietly commissioned blacksmiths to experiment with dragonglass arrowheads and spear points, passing it off as an exotic curiosity from Dragonstone or as a novelty to bolster morale. The vow hissed in his mind, but because he was not explicitly naming the others, not openly defying the Night King, the compulsion did not fully clamp down on him. The line was razor-thin, but he walked it with grim determination. Meanwhile, rumors continued to filter in from the wall. More sightings of undead whites, free folk crossing the ice rivers in droves. Benjen Stark had vanished on a ranging. The new First Ranger, Ser Waymar Royce, was found dead under bizarre circumstances. Ned's heart panged for his brother's fate, uncertain if Benjen was even alive. Yet a deeper dread told him that the Night King's final plan was accelerating. Sooner or later, the others would move. Then all the realm would be in peril. He tried to reason how best to warn Robert or Jon Arryn without the vow clamping down, but found no easy path. Any direct mention of the White Walkers or their true power threatened to freeze his mind and choke his words. He hated himself for his impotence. Winterfell's godswood became his refuge. In the presence of the ancient weirwood tree, he prayed. He did not know if the old gods heard him. He pleaded for a chance to break free, to defend the living from the nightmares stirring beyond the wall. One dawn, as he knelt at the black pool, he sensed movement behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of his children. Instead, an old crone with ragged robes stood there. She carried a staff carved from weirwood, her eyes clouded. She introduced herself as simply a wanderer passing through, seeking the boon of Winterfell's hospitality. But there was something uncanny about her, a subtle power in her stance. Ned, wary, gestured for her to speak. She leaned on her staff and said she felt a great chill around him, an ancient curse. Instantly, Ned's pulse quickened. No ordinary wanderer would see such a thing. He asked who she was, voice tight. She said she had no name that mattered, but she was once of the children of the forest, changed or exiled. Her features were not overtly inhuman, but her wrinkled skin and blackened fingers suggested some connection to deep magic. "I see the mark of the Great Other on you," she said in a whisper that chilled his veins. Ned felt the vow tighten, like ice scraping inside his skull, warning him not to speak. He clenched his jaw. The crone continued, "That power has awakened again. The long night is stirring." Ned struggled to respond, but the vow made him mute. The old woman seemed to sense it. "You are bound," she murmured, narrowing her eyes. "I cannot break it easily, but perhaps we can weave a path of shadows." Ned's heart pounded. Was this a chance at salvation? The vow flared, punishing him with a wave of cold that made him gasp. The crone stepped closer, pressing a gnarled hand to his forehead, and in that moment, he felt a surge of warmth that momentarily blunted the vow's effect. "Listen carefully," she said. "The Night King's hold on you is not absolute. Your soul is still your own. If you tread carefully, you may act against him, though you cannot speak openly. You cannot take direct action to break the vow, nor can you tell your secrets. But you may build a hidden fortress of hope. Gather resources that harm his brood. Align with those who fight the darkness. In time, the old magics may be undone." Ned trembled, tears burning in his eyes. He managed a whisper, "Help me, for the sake of my children, for the realm." The crone nodded. "I will, but be warned. The Night King's power is ancient and cunning. He will sense betrayal. You must always mask your intentions, cloak them in cunning. When the time comes, the North must rise. No other part of the realm will believe in this threat until they see it with their own eyes." Ned bowed his head in gratitude, tears freezing on his lashes. Before he could speak further, the crone vanished into the morning mist, leaving him uncertain if she had ever been real. Yet he felt a faint ember of hope. If someone could see his curse, could block the vow's immediate punishment, then perhaps there was a chance. He wiped his face, steeling himself. He would continue his covert preparations. He would not break his vow directly, but he would do everything possible to ensure the living stood a fighting chance. In the months that followed, a strange duality defined Lord Eddard Stark. On the surface, he was Winterfell's solemn but noble ruler, ensuring the North's readiness for any southern conflict. He convened with lords, oversaw new fortifications, trained men extensively, all under the guise of regional stability. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he sent discreet messages to some of the most trusted houses. House Manderley in White Harbor, House Serwyn, House Glover, House Umber, hinting at a hidden menace. He never named it, never put words to the page that might trigger the vow's wrath. But in carefully chosen phrases, he urged vigilance, reminding them that winter was coming, that the old tales might hold more truth than they guessed. Some responded with confusion, others with silent agreement. He did not dare do more. At night, the vow still tormented him. Occasionally, he felt the Night King's presence brushing against his mind, checking for disloyalty. Each time, Ned braced himself, burying his rebellious thoughts beneath layers of routine concerns. The vow seemed satisfied that Ned was not openly rallying the realm against the others. The subterfuge was precarious, but it held. Meanwhile, ravens arrived from beyond the wall with increasing frequency. Lord Commander Mormont warning that wildling gatherings were not the only threat. The whites were multiplying. Rangers reported glimpses of entire villages of the dead. The king beyond the wall, Mance Raider, had formed a vast host. But behind that host was a deeper power. The final war brewed in the White Wastes, unstoppable. Time marched on. The realm changed. Jon Arryn died in King's Landing under suspicious circumstances, rumored to be poison. Robert Baratheon, in his grief, turned to Eddard Stark again, wanting him to serve his hand. Ned felt the vow shudder, an opportunity to sabotage the realm from its highest seat, yet also an opportunity to better prepare for the coming storm. Ned wrestled with the decision for days, nearly driven mad. In the end, he refused Robert's summons, pleading that his duties in the north were too great, that the wildlings threatened the realm's safety from the northern border. Robert grudgingly appointed Tywin Lannister as Hand, an event that further divided the great houses. The vow was satisfied that Ned remained in the north, close to the staging ground of the others, ensuring no southern armies would come to reinforce the watch in time. As the nights grew longer, tidings from the wall became dire. The Night's Watch was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of wildlings crossing the border. Then came a raven with a single line, "The White Walkers are upon us." The vow sparked in Ned's mind, both exulting in the other's advance and tormenting him for feeling horror. He summoned his bannermen under the pretense of supporting the watch, but it was too late to hold the wall in a traditional sense. Instead, Ned quietly orchestrated fallback plans, secret instructions to man the fortress of the Dreadfort, to rally at the last hearth, to ring the perimeter around Winterfell with watchers. He said it was to handle wildling refugees or to keep them from pillaging the countryside. In truth, he prepared the North to fight the war the realm had long forgotten. He had only so many men, so few resources. But if the others came, Ned meant to make them bleed ice, vow or no vow. The day the wall fell was bleak and full of screaming winds. Ravens fluttered into Winterfell's rookery all at once, frantic, as though fleeing a terror that defied sense. Maester Luwin read the messages aloud in shock. The watchers on the towers reported seeing an unearthly glow pulsing in the far north. Ned felt the vow burn. His nightmares had become reality. The others were moving south, unstoppable as a glacier, with whites in the tens of thousands. He assembled the North's armies outside the walls of Winterfell. Rows of men in fur cloaks, steel helms, trembling with the cold. The sky was gray, snow swirling. Robb Stark, now in adolescence, stood at Ned's side, uncertain but determined to prove himself. Catelyn watched from the battlements, fear etched on her face. The vow demanded Ned open the gates to the dead, yet his paternal instinct told him to slam them shut. He reeled from the mental clash, staggering. The men around him rushed to steady him. Hours later, the first wave of wildling refugees arrived, half-frozen, eyes wild with terror. Many collapsed at the gates of Winterfell, crying that the dead were behind them. The army parted to let them pass, but Ned did not relent in vigilance. He had stationed archers on the walls, armed with carefully hoarded dragonglass arrows. The vow churned in his mind, punishing him for this hidden betrayal. White-hot agony lanced through his skull. He endured it in silence, for the alternative was letting these horrors sweep over his people without a fight. Night fell. A hush descended over the wide fields around Winterfell. Torches flickered along the ramparts, bathing the walls in a sickly orange glow. Snow continued to drift, thick and relentless. Ned sensed it before he saw it. An awful presence approaching, a cold wave of magic that rippled across the land. Men on the walls began to shout. Catelyn stared into the darkness, white-faced. Across the snow-laden fields, shapes emerged, tall, pale silhouettes, their eyes burning with that unnatural blue. Behind them, a vast army of the dead, once free folk, once black brothers, once men of the North. They shuffled forward in silent unison, the wind carrying the stench of decay. The living hearts on Winterfell's ramparts thundered in terror. Ned felt his pulse quicken. The vow hammered, ordering him to open Winterfell's gates, to sabotage the defense. But he fought it with every fiber of his being. He moaned, dropping to one knee. A few men rushed to his aid. Robb clutched his father's arm, alarmed. "Father!" Ned's eyes rolled back as wave after wave of cold cut through his brain. But somehow he withstood it. The brand on his brow burned, but he kept his fists clenched on the battlement's stones. He would not betray his home. If he could hold out, the men could fight. Perhaps they would fail in the end, but they would fight. The vow hissed at him, threatening to stop his heart. He groaned again, feeling as though his blood turned to slush. But he stayed on his feet. He did not call for the gates to open, did not sabotage the archers or the men. He simply collapsed against the stone. The vow tortured him, but it could not override the old magic of Winterfell's foundations, or the loyalty in his heart. He spat blood, forcing his head up to watch the others approach. The first whites came within arrow range. Ned croaked a command and the archers loosed. Dragonglass arrowheads whistled through the air. Dozens found their marks, smashing into the dead. Many whites collapsed, shrieking silently, as the obsidian burned through their bodies with crackling cold. Men on the walls cheered. Others soared in from behind the whites, those pale, slender creatures swinging their ice swords, deflecting some arrows with inhuman skill. A few took direct hits, shattering in an explosion of icy fragments. The watchers shouted with both fear and triumph. The ancient weapons of the children of the forest worked. The vow raged inside Ned, punishing him further, but he saw that not all was lost. The living had a chance. Then the Night King appeared. He strode out of the darkness at the head of the others, a being of chilling majesty, eyes lit with that same dark blue. He lifted an arm and the wind howled, A wave of cold air hammered the walls, extinguishing torches, freezing men's fingers to their bows. The gates shuddered under a sudden assault, frost creeping over the iron bars. Archers reeled, dropping from the ramparts, some plunging to their deaths. Chaos reigned. Ned staggered, gripping the stone. He locked eyes with that monstrous figure below. A terrible pain lanced him. The vow roared in his mind, furious that he was resisting. The brand on his brow flared like frostbite. He gasped, but a lifetime of stubborn northern honor fed his resistance. He refused to open the gates, refused to yield. He could do nothing to command the men forward, but at least he would not actively sabotage them. The Night King's gaze held Ned's, as if in silent disbelief that his thrall dared to defy him. A malevolent aura shimmered in the air, swirling with flurries of ice. Eddard felt a tug in his soul, as though the Night King intended to yank him from the battlements to kneel in the snow. He fought it. He heard a faint whisper at the back of his mind, perhaps the voice of that old crone, or the old gods themselves, urging him to hold on. Robb was at his side, brandishing a sword, calling to the men. If Ned fell, at least his son would carry on the fight. Then the battle began in earnest. Whites reached the walls, clawing at the stones. The living poured flaming oil on them, loosed more obsidian arrows. Guttural moans and the clang of weapons echoed into the night. The others moved with lethal grace, cutting down defenders with shimmering blades. Men screamed, their steel swords shattering upon contact with those ice-forged weapons. But the defenders who bore dragonglass spearheads managed to destroy a few of the others in bursts of pale shards. The king in the north, or so they had once called Ned. Now, ironically, the king of the dead was at his gates. Time lost meaning in the swirl of combat. The courtyard of Winterfell was soon a site of chaos as whites managed to scale or break through weaker sections of the wall. Inside, the North's defenders fought valiantly, hacking and stabbing at corpses. Each white that fell to obsidian or fire collapsed into limp flesh. But for every one that fell, 2 more clambered over. The stench of rot and the metallic tang of blood filled the air. Ned, barely conscious from the vow's torment, descended to the courtyard to rally his men if he could. He dared not speak a direct order to fight the others. If he did, the vow might kill him. Instead, he shouted general commands to hold formation. He used coded phrases, "Men of the North, remember your training." Over and over, he repeated them, letting the men fill in the blanks of what needed to be done. It worked to some extent. The vow raged, the brand on his brow searing, but it did not stop him from these indirect commands. Amid the frenzy, he glimpsed the Night King gliding into the courtyard, accompanied by a cluster of others. Flames on the ground sizzled as the cold emanating from them snuffed out the fire. Bodies of the dead froze where they lay, only to be reanimated if the entire body was intact. Warriors from House Umber rushed the others, brandishing clubs tipped with obsidian, but they were cut down in a flurry of ice sword swipes. Ned felt an overriding sense of doom. The foe was overwhelming, unstoppable. The vow sang in triumph even as Ned's heart broke. He watched the others approach the great keep, unstoppable. Then, as if by some final miracle, the crone he had seen in the gods would appeared at the heart of the courtyard, staff raised. She was battered, half limping, but she chanted in a language older than the first men. A swirl of greenish light burst from her staff, forming a barrier that momentarily held back the others. They shrieked, retreating as if repelled by an unseen force. In that pause, men rallied around the crone, forming a ring of spears and shields. The vow hammered at Ned, but the presence of her magic dampened the Night King's hold. For a moment, Eddard tasted freedom. He lifted a fallen sword, one set with obsidian shards, and advanced on the nearest other. The vow tried to freeze his muscles, but the crone's chant dulled its power. With a raw yell, Ned struck. The obsidian shards ripped through the other's arm, and it exploded into icy fragments. 2 more others descended, swords out. Around them, the whites shambled, but the ring of defenders fought with renewed vigor. Robb and a handful of skilled fighters had formed up, heads lowered, adopting a phalanx with spears glinting. The crone pointed her staff at the Night King. A swirl of crackling energy lashed out, but the ancient being raised an arm, absorbing the blast with only a shimmer of frost. For a heartbeat, Ned saw what might be described as amusement flicker in those terrible eyes. The Night King advanced, ignoring lesser men, focused on the crone and Ned. The vow yanked at Ned's soul again, commanding him to kneel, to defend the king. Ned resisted, trembling. He wanted to hurl his obsidian sword at that monstrosity, but the vow threatened to stop his heart. A strangled cry escaped him. He sank to one knee, warring with the compulsion. The crone tried once more to unleash her ancient magic, chanting words that echoed with the ring of shattered ages. The Night King stepped forward, raised his ice sword, and brought it down in a single unstoppable arc. The staff snapped in two. A burst of greenish flame erupted, sending the crone flying backward, broken. The watchers cried in despair. Still, the barrier lingered, flickering around them. The Night King pivoted to face Ned, the swirl of snow intensifying, as if the entire winter night had converged in that courtyard. A hush fell, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Ned looked up through the haze of white, meeting that ancient gaze. The vow demanded he bow, but some spark of the old Ned, the man of unyielding honor, refused. If this was the end, let it be with defiance. A tear froze on his cheek. He gripped the obsidian sword with whitening knuckles, summoning the last of his will. Snow and ice whipped around him, the brand on his brow seared. He forced his arm up, pointing the blade at the Night King. A silent challenge. A new voice sounded, echoing across the courtyard. A war horn. The watchers on the walls shouted, pointing south. Torches flickered in the distance. Thousands of torches. A late-arriving host. House Manderley had arrived from White Harbor, joined by barons and knights from the Vale. Unbeknownst to Ned, Jon Arryn's last act had been to quietly muster a relief force, suspecting Ned had told him only a fraction of the truth. Ranks of armed men poured onto the fields outside Winterfell, quickly realizing the horror before them. Another horn blast. They rushed into the undead ranks from behind, taking the whites by surprise. Flaming arrows soared, some tipped with dragonglass, others with wildfire purchased at great expense. A wave of emerald flame lit the night. Screeches of the dead erupted. The others twirled to face the new threat. The Night King, forced to divert his attention, let the swirl of ice subside slightly. Ned felt the vow's torment ease. If the realm stood united even slightly, there was hope. Men roared, surging forward. The courtyard battle intensified anew. The Night King hissed, raising his sword to the sky. A wave of bitter cold spread, slowing the oncoming men. But they had momentum. Arrows rained upon the undead. War cries echoed in the night. Robb Stark led a charge of northern knights, cutting down whites with practiced efficiency. The Night King's legion was vast, but it was pinned between Winterfell's walls and the newly arrived forces. The vow within Ned was chaotic. The Night King's hold was tested by the presence of so many living warriors rallying to break the siege. Still, the ancient being would not be easily defeated. Step by step, the living pushed the undead from the courtyard, driving them back into the outer wards. The Night King retreated to a vantage by the gate, summoning fresh whites from the piles of corpses on the battlefield. Ned saw them rise again, slack jaws opening in silent screams, newly turned to fight for the winter. But the living pressed on. Among them, the crone, battered but still breathing, tried to stand. She locked eyes with Ned, gesturing for him to attack. He mustered his final shred of defiance. With a roar, he led a handful of the best knights directly at the Night King, brandishing obsidian weapons. The vow's pain flared, threatening to stop his heart. He gritted his teeth, tears of agony in his eyes, but he kept running. They engaged the others that guarded the Night King. Ned's sword clashed with an ice blade, and shockwaves of cold exploded, but the obsidian shards cracked the other's weapon. The creature dissolved. Another tried to spear Ned from behind, but a northern night tackled it, both disappearing into a swirl of frost. The vow hammered at Ned, forcing him to gasp for breath. The brand felt like it was sizzling on his flesh. The Night King glared at him, as if personally affronted. Snow whipped into a vortex, and all sounds muffled as the ancient monster stepped forward. The rest of the fighting seemed to fade, as if the courtyard belonged to only the two of them. Ned's mind blurred with pain. The vow demanded total obedience, but some presence, maybe the old gods, maybe the crone's lingering magic, allowed him a moment of free will. He lunged with the obsidian blade. The Night King parried with unnatural speed, the ice sword striking sparks from Ned's weapon. A wave of cold blasted Ned off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. The vow seized him, pinning him, urging him to stay down. He heard the faint ring of steel, the cries of men, the roar of flames. He forced himself to rise inch by inch. The vow constricted his muscles, almost snapping them. The brand on his brow glowed in the darkness, ice creeping across his face. But he rose. For his children, for his people, for a realm that did not deserve to fall to this inhuman evil, he would not yield. The Night King raised his sword to deliver a final strike. Just then, an arrow whistled out of the darkness, dragonglass dip, from a vantage on the wall. It struck the Night King's shoulder, lodging itself in that frozen armor. The ancient being hissed in pain, reeling slightly. In that instant, Ned summoned all his strength. He lunged again, driving his obsidian sword into the Night King's chest. Ice crackled. The vow screamed in Ned's mind, shredding him from within. He felt his own heart lurch, caught in a wave of unimaginable cold. He bellowed in pain, tears freezing on his cheeks, but pushed the blade deeper. A sound like glaciers calving reverberated in the courtyard. The Night King's dark blue eyes flared, then dimmed as cracks spiderwebbed across his body. For a moment, time hung suspended. Then the ancient evil exploded into shards of ice that disintegrated in the wind. The backlash slammed into Ned like a sledgehammer. The vow snapped, releasing a torrent of freezing energy that coursed through his veins. He fell to the ground, convulsing, white froth at his lips, as centuries of bound magic tore free. The wights still standing collapsed in piles of dead flesh. The others that remained shattered or fled, screaming in alien terror. Men of the north cheered in astonishment as the tide of the undead faltered. The battle turned into a rout, with the living swiftly dispatching the stunned wights. A sudden hush fell as the last echoes of the supernatural wind died away. Snow drifted gently to the ground. The night sky was still dark, but something had changed. The presence that had cloaked the battlefield in dread was gone. Robb sprinted to his father's side, falling to his knees on the icy stones. He lifted Ned's limp form, calling out, tears in his eyes. Caitlin arrived moments later, frantic. Ned was alive, barely, his breath faint plumes of mist. Blood trickled from his nose and ears. The brand on his brow was gone, leaving only a faint scar shaped like a half-frozen swirl. He stared up at his family with unseeing eyes, lips parted. Then, with a final shudder, he inhaled deeply, and the cold exhaled from him in a visible swirl. His vision cleared, focusing on Robb. He tried to speak but only managed a ragged whisper. "My son, your mother, safe?" Caitlin nodded, tears streaming. Ned closed his eyes in relief. He had broken the vow at the last, destroyed the Night King, saved his family. Or so it seemed. The battered courtyard lay littered with corpses, both living and dead. Many had perished. The walls were splattered with gore, and fires still burned in pockets where wildfire had ignited. The crone who had helped them was nowhere to be found, perhaps buried in the ruins or vanished once more. But the North had survived a cataclysmic clash that might have doomed the realm. Knights from the Vale and White Harbor, bloodied but resolute, helped put the final wights to rest. Dawn broke, a pale sun shining over the blood-soaked snow. They carried Eddard into the great keep, laying him in his bed. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, wrestling with fever and the aftershocks of the vow's destruction. During that time, word spread across the land of the great victory at Winterfell, an unbelievable story of the White Walkers' defeat, the Night King's destruction, and the heroic stand of House Stark and its allies. Ravens flew to King's Landing and beyond, carrying tidings of events that felt like they belonged to a myth. Many would doubt the tale. Some would dismiss it as northern exaggeration. But those who fought in the courtyard of Winterfell, who saw the others with their own eyes, knew the truth. The long night had nearly returned, only to be cast back by a final act of defiance. Finally, on the fourth morning, Ned stirred and found Catelyn at his side. Sansa stood behind her, weeping tears of relief. Arya, hiding behind her mother's skirts, peered at Ned with wide eyes. Robb hovered near the foot of the bed, posture stiff with worry. Bran and Rickon were too young to grasp the fullness of what happened, but they sensed the gravity in the air. Ned's voice was weak, but he spoke. "It's over." Robb nodded. "The dead are gone. For now," he added somberly. Ned closed his eyes, exhaling. The vow was gone, the brand shattered, but the memory of that unnatural subjugation lingered like a scar on his soul. In the days that followed, the Lords of the North and the Vale convened in Winterfell's great hall to honor the fallen. Bonfires burned, sending plumes of smoke into the cold sky. A heavy gloom hung over the gathering, for victory had come at a terrible price. Hundreds of knights, bannermen, and small folk had died. Houses had been left leaderless, but a new unity was forged in those flames. Men who had doubted the tales of White Walkers or ridiculed the notion of ancient evils were now believers. Ned oversaw the mass funeral rites, speaking quietly of the cost. He said nothing of how he had been bound to the Night King, though a few had glimpsed the brand on his brow. Let it remain a secret. The realm needed a united front, not the knowledge that its champion had once served the very evil he destroyed. Robert Baratheon himself arrived a fortnight later, though the roads were slow. He came with a lavish entourage, wanting to see the site of the battle. He had a face etched with both shock and guilt, realizing how close the realm came to disaster while he japed in King's Landing. He embraced Ned fiercely, ignoring the formalities of court. "Seven hells, Ned," he growled, voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all. I should have heeded your warnings." Ned lowered his eyes, uncertain how to respond. The vow had forced him to discourage Robert's aid, but Robert did not know that. The memory of his own complicity weighed on him. Still, the realm was safe for now. Some asked if the others were truly gone for good. Ned gave no certain answer. The old tales suggested that as long as the long night might come again, the White Walkers could return. But the Night King himself was destroyed, undone by obsidian and a final act of defiance. Perhaps a new generation might one day forget the horrors, only to face them again. For the moment, the realm needed time to heal. The watchers on the wall would remain vigilant, hopefully stronger with the realm's renewed support. In time, the scars would fade into stories. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Winterfell rebuilt its shattered walls. Farms around the castle were resown, the villagers returning to their homes. The allied forces departed, though some left men behind to guard the north. The Vale's knights rode back through the mountains, singing songs of the undead battle. White Harbor's ships traveled the coasts, carrying the tale of the Night King's last stand. And in the Godswood, Eddard Stark knelt often, gazing at the carved face of the weirwood. He offered thanks for his deliverance, praying the realm might be spared another such horror. The brand scar on his brow tingled sometimes, reminding him of that unholy vow. Yet in it, he also found a grim testament to the strength of a man's honor and love for his family. One evening, as twilight settled over the courtyard, Ned stood on the battlements with Robb, Sansa, Arya, and baby Bran in his arms. The sky blushed with the last light of the sun, fading into crisp northern stars. Robb, now older by more than a year of war, asked quietly, "Father, will they ever come back?" Ned looked into the distance, the winds rustling his cloak. He thought of the swirling snow, the inhuman eyes, the brutal compulsion that had nearly broken his soul. Finally, he rested a hand on Robb's shoulder. Perhaps, but if they do, the North and all Westeros will remember this day. We will be ready. Arya, solemn for once, nodded. Sansa shivered, imagining those nightmares. Bran cooed, oblivious to the gloom. Ned turned to them, forcing a small smile. For now, we have each other. For now, summer will come again. Let us cherish it. Below them, in the yard, the men of House Stark lit lanterns along the walls, symbolic of the light that drove back the dark. Far away, in the land of swirling snow, the magic that had once animated the others lay shattered, though embers of it might remain. The final truth was that evil never truly died, only slept. But Eddard Stark, freed of his cursed vow, stood as living proof that even the coldest darkness could be opposed by the unyielding warmth of a father's love for his family, of a lord's duty to his people. He would bear the scars forever, but perhaps from those scars the North and the realm would find new strength. And so ended the tale of Eddard Stark, who once served a darkness beyond comprehension, who nearly brought doom upon all he held dear, yet found the courage at the last to break free. Generations to come might sing songs of the day Winterfell stood against the night, or they might forget. But for those who were there, who saw the dawn break over the battlefield strewn with fragments of ice and the still forms of wights, the truth needed no songs. It was etched in their hearts. For Eddard Stark himself, it would remain a ghost haunting his every dream, a reminder that duty and love could overcome even the blackest magic, if only by the narrowest margin. Thus the North endured, awaiting the next horizon of fate. And so the words rang true, as they always did. Winter is coming. But this time the realm would know to face it head-on, unafraid. Eddard Stark awoke each morning with the memory of wind and ice lingering in his thoughts, a subtle echo of the Night King's vow that had once chained his soul. Though that unholy tether was broken, it had not vanished without leaving scars. Some nights, he dreamed of the moment he drove the obsidian blade into that ancient being. He could almost feel again the biting cold surging up his arm and the brand on his brow searing with unimaginable agony. When he woke, sweat soaked his sheets, and he would run a trembling hand across the faint scar above his eyebrows, where the cold imprint of the Night King once glowed. Those who knew nothing of his ordeal, most of the realm, assumed it was a mere bruise or a relic of the brutal fighting. Those who had stood in the courtyard that night, glimpsing the swirling energies, suspected more. Yet even they did not know the full truth of the vow or how close Eddard Stark had come to delivering Winterfell, indeed all of Westeros, into the arms of living death. In the weeks after that cataclysmic battle, Winterfell bustled with the work of rebirth. The battered walls were patched with fresh stone. Broken gates were torn down, the iron bars twisted beyond measure by supernatural frost, and replaced with thick new beams. Men labored day and night, spurred on by a fierce determination not to let the darkness return so easily. The inner courtyard, once a grim killing ground strewn with corpses, some of them left in unnatural states of half-frozen contortion, had been scoured clean. The smell of blood and rot lingered in the cracks, but the living overcame it with daily scrubbings of boiling water and lye. The scattered remains of the others had long since melted into nothing, or been carried away by gusts of winter wind. The few shattered fragments that remained had turned to inert slush, baffling the maesters who examined them. Maester Luwin, at Ned's request, had quietly collected every shard he could before they vanished. He believed in archiving evidence that such beings were more than a myth, so that future generations might heed the warning. The Northern Lords, along with those visiting knights and bannermen who had come to Winterfell's rescue, lingered longer than they might have under normal circumstances. There were wounded to care for, provisions to coordinate, and the deep shock of what they had witnessed. Only slowly did they disperse back to their strongholds and holdfasts, each carrying with them the story of the great terror they had faced. The Vale men spoke of how they arrived to see a literal army of the dead pressing the walls of Winterfell. White Harbor's knights recounted the sight of inhuman figures made of ice, weapons glinting with frostfire. The men of House Umber, House Glover, and others who had been in the thick of battle still suffered nightmares. Yet for all that, there was an undercurrent of pride. They had defied a threat from legend and survived. More than once, Eddard heard men calling him the Stark who slew the Night King. Though he tried in vain to dismiss the title, he had not done it alone. It took the entire strength of the North, aided by last-minute reinforcements, the presence of that mysterious crone, and above all the magic of obsidian. But the realm preferred simpler stories. Robert Baratheon's arrival in Winterfell came with a clamor of trumpets and the stomping of horses. Though still hale, Robert had clearly aged in the years of peace, and his face betrayed the weight of a near disaster that had unfolded without his direct involvement. Guilt, sorrow, and an odd relief commingled in his booming laughter as he embraced Ned in the great hall. Robert kept repeating that he should have listened more keenly to Jon Arryn's last warnings, that he should have ridden north months before. Ned merely bowed his head, uncertain how to speak of the truth. What could he say? That the vow forced him to sabotage the kingdom's unity at the exact time they should have raised a grand host? That every day he had undermined the possibility of the king riding north in time? Robert only knew the end result. The others came, and the North, thanks to House Stark's unwavering resilience, managed a desperate victory. The king stayed for nearly a fortnight, wanting to survey the aftermath and see the so-called corpses of the others, though there were none left to show. He questioned men at length, from lords to humble archers, about what they had seen. Their accounts matched in the broad strokes. Tall, pale creatures with eyes of cold fire, whites in appalling numbers, the swirling black presence of an otherworldly king. 7 hells, Robert muttered one morning, when Ned showed him the new arrowheads his men were forging from obsidian. So those old stories about dragonglass were true. Robert's voice sounded baffled, as though the world itself had turned upside down. For him and many in the South, White Walkers belonged to the Age of Heroes, a cautionary tale that no one truly believed. Now he faced living proof. It rattled him more than the rebels or Targaryens ever had. Eddard was present for these discussions, standing often beside Robert in silent dignity. Each time Robert pressed for details, Ned offered what he could without revealing the darkest secret of all. He let men like Ser Roderick Castle or Lord Manderley's knights recount the harrowing moments. He allowed them to shape the narrative. How the Night King stepped forward, how Ned alone had plunged an obsidian blade into the monster's chest. Robert would turn to Ned and raise an eyebrow, wanting to hear his own words. Ned would just say, "I did what duty demanded, Your Grace." Even so, each retelling weighed on Ned's conscience, reminding him that for a terrible span, he was no champion. He had been enthralled. If not for a last spark of defiance, if not for the old crone's intervention and the timely arrival of allies, he would have opened Winterfell to the dead. It made him sleepless at night. He almost wished Robert's scribes would craft a more complicated tale. Outside the Great Hall, life carried on. Catelyn busied herself with caring for the wounded, organizing charitable distributions from the Winterfell stores, and comforting families that had lost husbands, fathers, or sons. She saw the toll it took on Ned but did not press him. Perhaps she feared that the truths he carried would only torment him further if dragged into the open. Their children tried to understand. Sansa still had nightmares about walking corpses. Arya, in her own way, asked pointed questions about the others. What did they eat? How did they die? Were they truly unstoppable? Robb, older and more composed, recognized that something in his father had changed forever. He offered silent support, standing by Ned's side whenever the weight of leadership grew too heavy. Bran was too young to grasp the deeper scars. Rickon was little more than a babe. Even so, the entire household felt a subtle tension whenever Eddard lapsed into a pensive quiet, eyes distant as though scanning a horizon no one else could see. When at last the king departed for King's Landing, he left behind a larger retinue of guards and a pledge. More men would be sent north to reinforce the wall. Ned looked into Robert's face, trying to read sincerity. Robert swore that he would do everything in his power to strengthen the Night's Watch, a vow that moved Ned to a quiet gratitude. But the Watchers on the wall had been decimated, and with all the realm's petty squabbles, Summoning a new generation to take the Black was hardly a quick fix. It would take time and gold, and the willingness of the Southern Lords to believe in a threat that might not return for years, decades, or centuries. Ned knew that the immediate crisis was over, but the next step would be ensuring a watchful peace, so that if any remnant of the others survived, they would never again catch the realm unprepared. He turned his attention to the region beyond the wall. They had defeated the greatest threat in living memory, but in the chaos of that final battle, the wildling hordes, those who had not been turned into whites, had scattered. Some were integrated into the north, seeking refuge, while others likely fled deeper into the wilderness. Mance Rayder, the so-called king beyond the wall, had disappeared amid the carnage. Whether he still lived was unknown. Ned organized scouting parties, led by the most skilled trackers of House Stark, House Reed, and other loyal families, to see if any pockets of the undead remained. These rangers, no longer strictly part of the Night's Watch but guided by Ned's authority, combed the haunted forests north of the Gift. They encountered roving bands of free folk, some starved, some wounded, some hoping to avoid further conflict, and they found no sign of White Walkers, only scattered whites that had apparently lost the unifying power of the Night King. Those they dispatched with fire and obsidian. Again and again, Ned heard from returning scouts that they discovered no new monstrous presence. It seemed the others, at least for now, were truly gone. Yet a subtle dread lingered in Ned's soul. He remembered how final the Night King's demise had seemed in old stories from the Age of Heroes, and yet that being had returned. Now he was destroyed again, this time by Ned's own hand, but the possibility of another resurgence lurked in Ned's mind. The others were tied to the cyclical nature of the long night, and so he wondered if some unseen power might reawaken them in another era. He shared this concern privately with Maester Luwin, who listened gravely and took copious notes. Luwin proposed building a new library tower dedicated to the lore of the others, the Children of the Forest, and the Dragonglass lore. Ned approved the project, providing funds and scribes to compile the knowledge. The last thing he wanted was for men to forget so easily. Life moved forward. Winter ended, or at least receded into one of the cyclical mild spells that the north called spring. Sunlight grew warmer, the snows melted in the fields around Winterfell, and farmers set about planting. Many small folk, once terrified by the walking dead, began to find hope again. They rebuilt homes destroyed in the fighting, or resettled villages abandoned by wildlings, and tried to coax the land back into fertility. The horrors of that winter night slipped slowly into the realm of cautionary legends. Nonetheless, the changes in Eddard Stark could not be dismissed. He who had once been known for his calm stoicism now seemed more prone to silent moods, walking alone through the Godswood at odd hours. One day, Catelyn found him kneeling in front of the heart tree in the earliest dawn light, his eyes distant. She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Ned," she said softly, "you've hardly slept. The nights are quiet now, yet you wake as though expecting an attack." He lowered his head, hiding the flicker of anguish in his eyes. "I still feel echoes." He said no more, unwilling to describe how it felt to remember the vow, to sense that swirling cold in his dreams. Catelyn did not push him. She only knelt beside him, offering him a silent comfort. In time, Ned began to reassert himself in daily governance. The tragedy had ironically solidified the North's loyalty. A sense of camaraderie bound the lords who had faced the dead together. Most recognized that Eddard Stark's leadership had saved them all. They listened more readily when he spoke. The same lords who might once have pushed back on taxes or obligations for the Watch now accepted them. So the war-torn region in the Gift was repopulated, with new outposts built near the wall. Lumber, stone, and supplies flowed. The Night's Watch, battered though it was, slowly swelled in ranks as Robert's promised men arrived, a mix of new recruits and older soldiers eager to earn some measure of redemption for the realm's near-miss. Old Bear Mormont still presided over the Watch, half in disbelief that he had survived the onslaught. He sent frequent updates to Ned, thanking him for every gesture of aid and telling of new rangers venturing deeper into the wilderness than any had dared in years. Amid these efforts, rumors reached Winterfell about the wider realm. House Lannister consolidated power in the west, with Tywin Lannister acting as Hand of the King. Some said the King's Landing court was rife with intrigues, with Cersei Lannister whispering into the king's ear. Others spoke of renewed tension in Dorne, where the Martells nursed old grudges. The Tyrells in Highgarden boasted of their harvests, apparently untroubled by the northern unrest. And from across the narrow sea came whispers of surviving Targaryens, Viserys and his sister Daenerys, children of the Mad King, rumored to be seeking an army to reclaim the Iron Throne. As Ned read each Raven scroll, he realized the realm was returning to its old preoccupations, the threat of the others already drifting like mist into memory for many. He shook his head at the shortness of men's recollections. He might have taken comfort in the stability of the North were it not for one gnawing puzzle. The old crone who had helped break the vow's immediate hold. She had vanished in the final chaos of that night. No trace of her body had been found among the fallen. Months passed with no word. Occasionally, Ned would question travelers or send inquiries to the villages, asking if they had seen an old woman with a carved weirwood staff. None had. He kept returning to the memory of her staff glowing in the courtyard, that greenish flame, and how it had momentarily blunted the Night King's power. If she still lived, perhaps she was wandering the north. Or perhaps she had gone back to wherever she came from, if she truly was linked to the children of the forest. Ned only wished he could thank her properly, or at least glean from her more knowledge about the vow that had nearly undone him. But all he heard was silence. One late afternoon, with the sun dipping low behind the towers, Ned stood atop Winterfell's battlements, gazing out over the landscape. The fields beyond the walls, once soaked in blood, now shimmered with the pale green of new spring growth. A breeze stirred, carrying faint scents of the forest. He felt a presence at his side and turned to see Robb, tall and solemn, leaning on the stone. The bow. Why, nearly a young man, had a new gravity in his gaze. He had seen too much for one so young. "Father," Robb said quietly, "I've been thinking about the battle, about everything. You once told me the White Walkers were legends. Now we know they're real or were real, for you destroyed them. But what if something else ancient and dark lies in wait?" He paused, uncertain of how to phrase his next thought. What if the others can come back again? Ned studied his son's face, hearing the echo of his own doubts. "We can never rule it out," he said at length, placing a hand on Robb's shoulder. "That is why the Watch must remain vigilant, and why we in the North must not forget." His voice turned somber. "Too often, men dismiss old tales as children's fables. We cannot afford that luxury. There are deeper powers in this world than we understand, powers of ice and fire." He trailed off, remembering the swirl of that vow around his mind. The sense of it still pricked at him sometimes like a phantom pain. "That is our burden, my son. To keep watch, to prepare. The day may come when you, or your children, must face a new winter." Robb nodded, determined. "We'll be ready. I swear it." That vow gave Ned a flicker of pride, though also a pang of sorrow. He did not want to see his son forced to bear such a burden. But if that was the price of safety for the realm, so be it. Summer arrived with unusual warmth for the north. The snows retreated farther, opening up roads that had been impassable for years. Trade caravans ventured north from the Riverlands, bringing southern goods to White Harbor and onward to Winterfell. The bustle of commerce lent the castle an air of normalcy, as though the horrors of the previous winter were a distant dream. Minstrels showed up in the great hall, crafting songs of the great battle that had ended the long night's resurgence. Some of the songs took wild liberties, claiming that Ned Stark had dueled the Night King in single combat on top of the wall, or that giants had joined the fray, or that children of the forest had unleashed living shadows. At first, Ned tried to correct the more outlandish details, but after a while, he let the minstrels spin their tales. If it made people heed the threat, better they remember it however they could. Meanwhile, King's Landing demanded new taxes to pay for the realm's reconstruction. Tywin Lannister, as Hand, was said to be ruthless in collecting coin. Some northern lords chafed at these demands. They argued that the North had just bled to save the realm from a threat the South dismissed as myth. Others pointed out that roving bandits in the Riverlands had taken advantage of the chaos, requiring additional stability. Ned found himself in an uncomfortable position. On the one hand, as Warden of the North, he had to maintain loyalty to the crown. On the other, his region was still rebuilding from an otherworldly invasion. He eventually negotiated a compromise with the king's officials, promising a steady but modest flow of taxes, deferring the rest until the harvests improved. It was not an ideal arrangement, but it kept the peace. That was not the only pressure on the North. The Iron Islands, under Balon Greyjoy, showed signs of renewed restlessness. Reports indicated raiders testing the coasts of the North, near Bear Island and further east. Ned dispatched loyal bannermen to reinforce those shores, determined not to let the Greyjoys stir new havoc when the scars of the undead army were still fresh. He did not relish another war, but he would not allow House Stark's seat to be threatened again. Catelyn helped coordinate with House Mormont, the fierce ladies of Bear Island, forging alliances that kept the Ironborn at bay. The tension never rose to a full-blown crisis, but the Watchers reported skirmishes at sea and the occasional raid on isolated fishing villages. And so the realm turned, uncertain, fractious, but momentarily at peace from the undead. Seasons came and went. Word spread that the Targaryen girl across the sea had married a great horse lord, a Khal. Some in the north said it mattered little to them. Targaryens had no ships, no alliances. Others worried that eventually dragons might return, though no living dragons were reported. Robert Baratheon, grown comfortable on his throne, seemed more concerned with hunts and feasts than with a potential Targaryen threat so far away. In truth, Ned found himself equally concerned with the immediate well-being of his people. The North was large, harsh, and only now recovering its population. The last thing Ned wanted was another war. But if war came, he would be ready. Years of relative calm passed. The horrors of that winter did not fully fade, but they became stories recounted around hearth fires during particularly cold nights. Children who had been babes at the time grew up with only second-hand accounts. To them, the notion of the dead walking in endless winter was a bedtime legend, one that might make them shiver but did not seem real. Yet, in Winterfell's library tower, a new generation of maesters, scribes, and historians pored over treatises on the others: the Long Night, the vow that had bound the Night King, and the properties of dragonglass. Ned funded these efforts quietly, insisting that knowledge must not be lost. He had a special glass case constructed for a few shards of shattered ice blades that had been collected from the battlefield. Over time, these shards melted into water, leaving only a faint residue. Still, the scribes kept them as a haunting reminder. Maester Luwin, older now, once approached Ned with a puzzling piece of information. He had discovered references in an ancient tome to something called the Heart of Winter, a rumored source of the other's power far in the northern wastes. Perhaps it was only a myth, but Luwin wondered if the destruction of the Night King might only be partial if that heart remained. Ned listened with disquiet. He remembered hearing hints of that phrase in his nightmarish visions during the vow, memories he tried to bury. But the book was inconclusive. Luwin wanted to send ravens to the Citadel, gather more knowledge. Ned consented. That was the best he could do, to remain watchful, gather knowledge, and hope they never again needed to fight that darkness. As Ned's children grew, each in their own direction, the flow of time felt both wondrous and bittersweet. Sansa blossomed into a poised young lady, adept at courtesies, though she carried a deeper awareness of the world's dangers than a typical southern lady. Arya became lean and quick, continuing her fascination with swordplay. Ned indulged her in small measure, letting her train with wooden swords, though Catelyn fretted that it was unseemly. Bran became a restless climber, scaling the walls and towers of Winterfell, often testing the boundaries of safety. Rickon, still a toddler when the battle took place, grew into a sturdy boy prone to fierce passions. And Robb, on the cusp of manhood, took on new responsibilities, learning to oversee household matters and ride at the head of a small retinue. In all of them, Ned saw flickers of hope for a future that might be free of monstrous evils. He tried to find peace in that, but sometimes, late at night, Ned would wander to the crypts beneath Winterfell. He would carry a torch and walk between the dark statues of ancient Stark lords, hearing the echo of his own footsteps. The statues seemed to judge him, or so he felt. When he came to the empty spaces set aside for future generations, he paused. In one shadowed alcove, he recalled kneeling in despair after returning from beyond the wall, still half enslaved by the vow. That memory haunted him, yet each time he reminded himself that, in the end, he had broken free. The brand on his brow was gone. The vow had shattered. The Night King had perished. That was the reality. One evening, after a final feast to celebrate Robb's 16th name day, Ned felt the familiar pull to the crypts. Descending into the cold darkness, he thought of how Robert had always teased him for his northern grimness. The truth was simpler. The North demanded a certain sobriety from those who ruled it, and after all Ned had experienced, there was little room for frivolity. He passed the resting places of Rickard, Brandon, and Lyanna Stark, offering silent homage. His father and siblings had died in the Targaryen madness, and Ned himself had nearly lost everything to a force older than any dynasty. He came at last to the deeper recesses, rarely visited, where the earliest Starks lay. To his surprise, the old crone stood waiting there, the dim flicker of his torch revealing her crouched shape. Her cloak was tattered, and her hair was sparse, but the staff she held was unmistakable. This time, the staff's carvings no longer glowed with that greenish light he remembered. They were just faint lines etched into pale wood. She lifted her face toward his torchlight. Her eyes glinted, reflecting the flicker of the flame, giving her an eerie aspect in the shadows. Ned's heart lurched at the sight. He had imagined this moment for years. "You are alive," he whispered. He half feared that she might vanish again. She nodded slowly. "For now," she answered in that gravelly voice that bore traces of countless winters. "I have wandered far, searching for cracks in the ice, for remnants of the great other's power. And I have come to speak with you, Eddard Stark, one last time." Ned stepped closer, his torchlight illuminating her lined face. In the gloom of the crypts, her features seemed partly inhuman. He could not say if it was merely age or if indeed her blood was mingled with that of the children of the forest. "I never had a chance to thank you," he said. "You freed me from the vow long enough for me to strike the Night King. You saved us all." She shook her head, lips quirking in a small, sad smile. "I did what had to be done, but a single victory does not mean the great other is vanquished for all time. You suspect as much in your heart." She reached a knotted hand and tapped the center of his chest, above his heart. "You still carry the memory of that power within you." Ned felt a chill, though the vow was gone. He exhaled, steadying himself. "I thought the others were undone, at least for this generation. Is there more?" Her eyes were grave. "There are always seeds left behind. The White Walkers are creations of ice, shaped by old sorceries. Some vanish with the death of their king, some remain dormant. The heart of winter is real, though distant beyond mortal ken. Its power waxes and wanes like the turning of seasons. One day it may stir again." She paused, letting her words settle in the darkness. "You must preserve the knowledge to fight them. You must ensure the living never forget. Else the next time the others rise, the living might not be so fortunate." Ned nodded, a sense of solemn duty washing over him. "That is what I've tried to do. The library tower, the training of my men, fortifying the wall." He sighed, remembering how many in the south had resumed bickering over trifles, leaving the defense of the realm's northern border in the Watch's uncertain hands. "Will it be enough?" The crone's staff clicked against the stone floor. "It is all anyone can do. Knowledge, vigilance, unity. These are the three pillars that can withstand the chill of the long night. When they fail, darkness finds its entry. Do not let the petty squabbles of kingdoms overshadow the truth you have lived." She drew a ragged breath. "I am old, Ned Stark. My time here fades, but I will carry your success in my memories. You must carry it in yours. Together, we push back the great other's designs." He felt emotion tugging at him, recalling how hopeless he had once been under the vow, how her intervention had granted him that window to strike the final blow. "I will not fail you," he said quietly, voice echoing in the crypt. "Or the realm." She inclined her head. "You need only keep your watch. Whether in this generation or the next, the North must always remember. Pass that memory to your children, and they to theirs." She began to turn away, her staff tapping on the stone as she receded into darkness. Ned's throat constricted. He reached out a hand, half wanting to ask her 1,000 questions. About the children of the forest, about the deeper magic, about the vow's torment. But something in her posture told him she had said all she meant to say. Before she vanished into the deeper labyrinth of the crypts, her voice drifted back to him in a whisper. "You fought the ice with your love and your honor. That is your true strength, Lord Stark. Cherish it." Then she was gone. Ned's torch flickered, revealing only ancient stones and still air. He lingered a moment longer, wondering if he should pursue her, but an instinct told him that she would not be found if she did not wish it. He bowed his head, murmuring a soft farewell. Then he climbed back to the upper levels, the torch's glow dancing on the steps. When he emerged into the courtyard, the chill night air felt somehow warmer than before. He gazed at the sky, where the moon hung pale over Winterfell's towers. Was that encounter real or another phantom vision? Either way, he felt renewed resolve in his chest. She was right. The realm's best defense against the cold night was unity, knowledge, and memory. He would pass that lesson on as far as he could. In the months that followed, Ned quietly doubled his efforts to coordinate with the Night's Watch and the Northern Bannermen. He wrote letters in his own hand to lords as far south as the Reach, reminding them of the debt they owed to the Watch and the necessity of readiness. Many responded politely, though with an undertone of skepticism. The Tarleys and Redwynes, for instance, wrote back that they would keep watch but saw no immediate threat. The Martells politely acknowledged the northern plight but expressed more interest in King's Landing's politics. Even so, a few smaller houses across the realm, especially those that had once been loyal to House Arryn, responded with genuine concern. They contributed small shipments of dragonglass or coin to the Watch, enough to help in some measure. Ned recognized that it was impossible to keep the entire realm focused on a danger that might not return for decades or centuries. But any preparation was better than none. Robb, stepping more fully into the role of heir to Winterfell, took it upon himself to train a new generation of fighters who would practice with dragonglass-tipped weapons in addition to steel. These men would pass on those techniques to future recruits, ensuring that even if the others returned long after Ned was gone, the knowledge would endure. The effort was small and sometimes overshadowed by more mundane nightly exercises, but it planted a seed. Sansa, for her part, worked with Maester Luwin to compile a layman's version of the histories, stories about the White Walkers that could be told to children in a more accessible form. Arya rolled her eyes at the project, preferring the clang of sparring, but eventually admitted that knowledge took many shapes. Bran listened, wide-eyed, enthralled by the notion of ancient battles and dark magic. 3 years after the battle that ended the Night King, a notable shift occurred in the realm. Daenerys Targaryen, across the sea, hatched 3 dragons in the aftermath of her husband Khal Drogo's death. Rumors of living dragons spread like wildfire. Robert Baratheon reacted with predictable fury, calling for the Targaryen girl's head, though the seas and deserts lay between them. Ned, hearing these tidings, felt a prickle of alarm. Dragons had once been the force that united the 7 kingdoms under House Targaryen, and they had also, ironically, been a weapon that might stand against the others if used wisely. But the Targaryens had not always chosen the path of wisdom, witness the Mad King's atrocities. Ned wrote to King's Landing urging caution, hoping to avoid a new war. But Robert's rage was stoked by old hatreds. He demanded swift action to eliminate the Targaryen line, seeing in dragons a threat to his monarchy. Tensions mounted. Spies roved Essos for hints of Daenerys' location. Word came that she had aligned with some of the freer cities, that she was forging a small but loyal following of exiled knights. While the South roiled with the question of dragons, the North watched the wall. Ned could not deny that the presence of dragons in the world made him uneasy. Fire was a power that could be harnessed for good or ill. If the White Walkers ever rose again, might dragonfire be the only certain way to stop them? The old texts told of the pact between the children of the forest and the first men, and the later Targaryen conquest that ended the long night's memory among some. Now the cyclical nature of things seemed to hint that ice and fire both had re-emerged in the world. What if they clash again? Ned wondered. But the realm was not ready for such a cataclysm. Over time, Robert's pursuit of the Targaryen threat escalated. He sent assassins across the sea, though many vanished into the deserts of Essos. The news disturbed Ned, reminding him uncomfortably of how the realm's resources might be wasted on a crusade that left their northern frontier weak. He argued with Robert's envoys that a defensive posture made more sense. Daenerys might never cross the sea if she lacked ships or alliances. Meanwhile, the realm needed to fortify the wall. The crown's officials mostly dismissed him, echoing the king's hatred of dragonspawn. They insisted the threat to the north was done, thanks to Ned's own heroics. "You slew the Night King," one letter read. "We owe you a debt, but we cannot remain forever in fear of fairy tale monsters. The Targaryen dragons are real, right now?" That letter made Ned grit his teeth. He had seen how ephemeral fairy tale could be when its sword of ice severed men's heads. But the realm was vast and forgetful. As Ned's hair began to show strands of gray, his children grew into early adulthood. Robb took more direct command of the northern forces, and men murmured that the young wolf was shaping up to be a formidable commander, well loved by his bannermen. Sansa caught the eye of several potential suitors, though Ned was wary of forging political marriages with southern houses that still doubted the horrors they had faced. Arya, refusing to be pinned down by betrothal talk, vanished on riding adventures with her companions, practicing archery and swordplay in defiance of the typical lady's tasks. Bran pored over the texts in the library tower, fascinated by hidden passages describing the children of the forest. Rickon, restless and wild, teased that he would one day cross the wall just to see what lay beyond. Ned would scold him firmly, warning that the land beyond the wall remained dangerous and untamed. Through it all, the memory of that vow had never fully left Ned. He did not speak of it, but he felt the difference. Something in him had been touched by a cold so profound it threatened to devour him. Even years later, a sudden gust of winter wind could jolt him with a faint echo of that terror. He found solace in small things: Catelyn's presence in their chambers at night, the laughter of his children in the courtyard, the routine of daily governance. After each day's end, he would sometimes recall how close he had come to losing all of it. How, had he yielded fully to the vow, Winterfell's gates would have opened wide to the army of the dead, delivering the realm into a new long night. Perhaps it was this closeness to doom that made him treasure the day-to-day. Eventually, a fresh piece of news came from the wall. A wildling band had been spotted near. The Frostfangs, carrying a peculiar artifact said to be carved from ice but never melting. The watchers who saw it swore that it glimmered in the moonlight like an other's blade, though its shape was more reminiscent of an idol or a statue. They also noted that the wildlings seemed fearful of the object, whispering that it had been found in a cave, left behind by the old shadows. The Watch sent a detachment to intercept them, hoping to confiscate it. Word reached Ned that the mission succeeded, but one of the Black brothers died mysteriously. The artifact was transported to Castle Black, locked away under heavy guard. Rumors abounded that it radiated a faint chill, that men who touched it had nightmares of dead forests and swirling ice. Some said it was merely a chunk of pretty ice the wildlings used to spook gullible crows. Others took it as a sign that some vestige of the other's power lingered. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jeor Mormont still, though older and more worn, sent a raven to Ned, asking if he wished to examine the artifact. At first, Ned hesitated, reluctant to stir old ghosts. But he recalled the crone's warning. Knowledge was a shield. Perhaps this item held clues to the deeper magic at play. He decided to make the journey to Castle Black personally, bringing Robb and a small entourage. Catelyn, concerned for Ned's well-being, wanted to accompany him, but he insisted she stay to oversee Winterfell. The road to the wall was long, but safer than it once had been. The scars of the great battle remained, but the land was at peace. They rode north, passing through the increasingly rugged terrain until the wall's impossible height appeared on the horizon. The swirling eddies of snow near its icy face reminded Ned of his first glimpses so many years ago, when he himself was not even sure the others were more than legends. Everything had changed. Castle Black was busier than he had seen in years, thanks to new recruits from the south. Tents and makeshift barracks lined the courtyard. The Black brothers bowed respectfully when Ned arrived, for his reputation among them was revered. He dismounted, greeted Mormont with the customary warm handshake, and exchanged pleasantries about the state of the realm. Then, after a simple meal in the commander's solar, he asked to see the artifact. Jeor Mormont hesitated. "It's locked in the deepest storage room, my lord. The men don't like going near it. They say it unsettles their dreams." Ned felt a prickle of unease. "I would see it anyway. Best we understand it." They descended flights of cold stone steps, passing storage areas filled with old crates, barrels, and Black Brother supplies. Finally, they reached a secure vault behind a heavy iron door. 2 guards stood watch, both looking somewhat pale. At Mormont's nod, they opened the door. Inside, a single torch revealed a squat room lined with shelves. At the center stood a large wooden crate. It was open, revealing an object draped in burlap. The air was strangely cold, far colder than the corridor outside, even in the presence of the torch. Mormont cleared his throat and, with trembling hands, peeled back the burlap. Underneath lay a block of ice shaped into something that might have been humanoid, or perhaps a weirwood figure from a fever dream. Its edges were jagged, half-formed, as if sculpted in haste or melted over time. Looking closer, Ned saw faint grooves that resembled eyes and a mouth. His stomach lurched with recognition. Something about those eye sockets reminded him of the Night King's face, though in a twisted, half-formed way. The thing was about the size of a small child, but its presence was distinctly unnerving. The torchlight refracted through it, creating little prisms of light that danced across the room. The reflection sent a cold gleam across Ned's face, and for a moment, he thought he heard a distant whisper of wind. Robb stood behind Ned, watching with wary fascination. "Is it alive?" he asked softly. Mormont shook his head. "It hasn't moved, but men claim they sometimes hear a faint moan near it at night. Others say it's just the wind." He gestured to a small black residue on the crate's edge. "We had a crow place a hand on it." His fingers got stuck for a moment, frostbitten, as if the thing was trying to draw the warmth out of him. He said he felt something, presence. Then he tore his hand free. Ned inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain steady. "And the wildlings who carried it, what did they say?" Mormont grimaced. "They said they found it in a hidden cave near the Frostfangs. Claimed it was a shrine to the White Walkers, or so their old legends named it. They wanted rid of the cursed thing. They tried to trade it for safe passage south of the wall." Ned reached out a hand but didn't touch the ice. He felt cold radiating. The brand on his brow might have been gone, but he sensed something akin to that vow's echo. The memory of that swirling presence made his heart pound. He whispered, "I can't say if it's an idol or a fragment of the other's magic, but it's dangerous." He turned to Mormont. "No one should touch it with bare skin. Keep it sealed away, perhaps in an iron chest. If we can find a way to destroy it, maybe with dragonfire or dragonglass, then we should. Unless there's some knowledge it might yield to the maesters." Mormont nodded. "We tried pressing dragonglass to it. The surface cracked slightly but then refroze. We thought about bringing it into the sunlight, but the sun up here is weak, especially in the shady vault. We can try to melt it, but the men fear letting it out in the open. What if it calls more undead?" He scratched his beard. "Perhaps we could send it to the Citadel, but the journey is long, and I'd rather not have it traveling half the realm." Robb stepped forward. "Father, Could we bury it in the deepest part of the wall itself? Let the ice swallow it. Ned considered. The wall is laced with old magic, or so the legends say. Magic meant to keep the others out. That might contain it. He eyed Mormont for confirmation. The Lord Commander pursed his lips, then gave a slow nod. We could carve out a hollow and seal it behind a foot of solid ice. That might keep it from doing harm. They agreed on the plan. Over the next 2 days, a small party of black brothers and stonemasons carefully transported the idol to a portion of the wall rarely accessed. They chiseled a chamber in the thick ice, deep enough to store the artifact. With great caution, wearing thick gloves and furs, they maneuvered the eerie statue inside. The cold seemed to intensify around it, as if the ice idol recognized it was being interred. One of the watchers swore he heard a thin scream, though the wind was howling at the time, so it might have been imagination. Nonetheless, they sealed the chamber with blocks of ice and poured water that froze in place, effectively entombing the idol. Ned and Robb stood by, ensuring the work was done thoroughly. When the last chunk of ice slid into position, the presence in Ned's mind, if it had been there, subsided. He felt a ripple of relief. Perhaps that was enough. Ned spent another week at Castle Black, speaking with officers, touring the ramparts, ensuring the watch's supplies were in order. He was gratified to see the garrison much stronger than in past years. Though discipline varied, at least the raw numbers and resources had improved. He listened to men's concerns about leadership vacancies, about tensions between new recruits from the south and old-timers from the north. Ned offered measured advice, reminding them that the Night's Watch was meant to be a brotherhood transcending petty boundaries. He had no illusions that the Watch was perfect, but he saw that morale was higher now that the others had been proven real. Men understood, at least in theory, the gravity of their oath. At last, Ned and Robb prepared to ride south to Winterfell. On the morning of their departure, Jeor Mormont joined them in the courtyard. "One more thing, Lord Stark," he said, voice raspy in the cold dawn air. "We hear rumors from the other side of the sea that the Targaryen girls' dragons are growing. Some fools among the Watch speak of a prophecy, that only Dragonfire can fully destroy the others, or anything tied to them. Perhaps if her dragons are real, and if they come west one day, we might use that to rid ourselves of any lingering vestiges of ice magic." The old bear shrugged. "Strange times we live in, when a black brother wonders if we should welcome dragons." Ned stared at him, a swirl of conflicting feelings in his chest. He had no love for Targaryens, but he also could not deny that Dragonfire was a formidable weapon. He recalled how Robert wanted them all dead. And yet, if the realm truly faced a cyclical threat from the great other's domain, might the realm need dragons one day? "Let us hope it does not come to that," Ned said quietly. "But if it does, we'll make the choice that serves the living." He offered a handshake, and Mormont clasped his forearm in respect. Then Ned and Robb rode out from the gates, the wind at their backs. The journey home was uneventful, the roads comparatively safe. Robb seemed lost in thought much of the ride. Ned asked him about his reflections, and Robb confessed, "Seeing that ice idol made the threat feel real again. I wonder how many more relics or pockets of sorcery lie scattered in the far north, waiting to be found." Ned sighed. "Likely too many, but we do what we must. Patrol, remain vigilant, bury the artifacts or destroy them. One day you may have to lead the realm in these tasks, Robb. I only pray the realm will follow." Robb met his father's gaze with a firm nod. In that moment, Ned felt a swell of pride. The boy he had raised in these last years was steady, courageous, and not blinded by illusions of grandeur. Perhaps he would be the lord the North needed in the darker times to come. Winterfell came into view at last, the great castle's familiar silhouette greeting them like an old friend. Maester Luwin and Catelyn waited in the courtyard, greeting them with relief. Rickon ran around their horses, shouting for his father and brother. Ned dismounted and hugged him, mindful that these small joys were what made everything worthwhile. Inside, the household bustled with news of a fresh envoy from King's Landing, likely about the Targaryen question. Ned braced himself, dreading yet another push to fund an assassination across the sea or raise an army to sail east. He told himself that such affairs must not overshadow the real threat that could arise from the north. The tension weighed on him, but he reminded himself that the living always had squabbles. If he could not steer them to unity, perhaps he could at least keep the north prepared. That evening, as Ned and Catelyn sat by the fire in their private solar, she touched his hand gently. "You look exhausted," she said, "and worried, though you have been for so long now. I sometimes forget how you were before." There was no accusation in her tone, only sadness. He squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I do not mean to burden you." She shook her head. "I married you for better or worse, Ned, and I have never regretted it. But I see how heavily these secrets weigh on you. For years you have carried them alone. Even here, in peace, you do not rest easy." She caught his eye, her expression softening. "Let me share whatever I can. If not the details, then your worry." Ned leaned his head back against the high-backed chair, letting the warmth of the fire soak into him. It reminded him of the living heat that had saved him when the vow tried to freeze his soul. He closed his eyes, inhaling. "I fear that what I faced back then was only a taste," he murmured. "I fear for our children's children. Yet the crone told me, it is enough to remain vigilant, to pass on that knowledge." Catelyn pressed her lips together, hearing the weight behind those words. "Then that is what we will do," she said simply. "We will prepare them to face whatever comes, and we will do so together." He opened his eyes, gazing at her with gratitude. A small smile tugged at his lips. "You are my warmth in the storm, Cat," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Thank you." She returned the smile, stroking his hair, the gentle crackle of the fire their only soundtrack. Beyond the walls of Winterfell, the realm churned through its cycles of conflict and alliance. Whispers of Daenerys Targaryen's growing might spread. Talk of dragons soared in taverns and feast halls. Robert Baratheon raged, wine goblet in hand, that the wolves in the north grew too proud of their victory over the dead, ignoring the real threat of Targaryen vengeance. The Lannisters, Tywin in particular, manipulated events to secure their power in the capital, forging new alliances. The Greyjoys tested the coasts. The Martells nursed old wounds. Every corner of Westeros was alive with petty or grand ambitions, as though the entire kingdom had once again forgotten the dire threat from beyond the wall. But House Stark did not forget. In the Godswood, the ancient heart tree watched with silent, carved eyes as Ned Stark knelt in prayer. The leaves overhead were a deep red, reflecting in the glassy black pool. Ned's reflection wavered on the water, showing lines on his face that had not been there in his youth. He remembered how he had prayed here before riding to the wall years ago, how he had prayed for strength to save the realm. Now, many years later, the battle was won, but the duty remained. A hush lay over the Godswood, and Ned found himself remembering the crone's words once more. That knowledge, vigilance, and unity were the keys. That his capacity for love and honor had broken the vow's final hold. He exhaled, letting the tension drain. He thought of Robert, of the Targaryens, of the machinations of men. Those were concerns that would consume the southern courts. Ned would do his duty as Warden of the North, but his truest devotion lay in ensuring that the realm never again faced the long night unprepared. The old gods, if they listened, might grant him the wisdom to guide his house in that path. With a final murmur of thanks for the countless small blessings, his children, his wife, the loyal men and women who had stood by him, he rose. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, as if in acknowledgement. In the courtyard, life bustled. Smiths pounding steel, stable boys tending horses, courtiers chatting about trade. Robb was drilling with swords, sparring with loyal retainers. Arya was coaxing her direwolf into performing some new trick. Sansa was walking with a group of ladies, pointing at sketches of new dresses. Bran and Rickon were racing about or bickering. It was an ordinary day, a testament that life persisted even after cataclysmic threats. Ned paused at the top of the steps, arms folded, simply watching them. The vow had nearly cost him these simple joys. In that moment, he felt a wash of gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He turned as he heard footsteps behind him. It was Maester Luwin, scroll in hand. "My lord, a raven from King's Landing. It concerns the realm's stance on the Targaryen matter. There is to be a council meeting, and they request your presence." Ned pressed his lips together. "They have their wars, their troubles. So be it. We will answer. But first, I must speak with my bannermen." He looked toward the yard, where his family moved in the soft sunlight. "The North cannot ignore the realm's call," he said quietly. "But neither can we forget the true threat. Let me see what they wish of us. We will guard our home either way." Luwin nodded, offering the scroll. Ned unrolled it, scanning the words. Indeed, King Robert and Tywin Lannister were hosting a grand council to address the problem of Daenerys's dragons. War or negotiation seemed the likely outcome. Already, the realm braced for a new struggle. Ned rolled the parchment closed. In his heart, a whisper of old fear still lingered. If the realm turned all its attention east, who would watch the north? He steeled himself. This too was part of his duty. He would do what he must to keep Westeros from destroying itself and leaving a vacuum for any lurking horror to return. He made his way down the steps, calling to Robb, summoning him from sword practice. "My son, prepare to gather your men," Ned said gently but firmly. "We ride for King's Landing in a fortnight. The king has called us, and we shall answer." Robb nodded, though a shadow of anxiety touched his eyes. Sansa overheard, perking up at the mention of the South. Arya scowled, as if anticipating a dull court. Bran looked curious, while Rickon pouted about the prospect of traveling. Catelyn emerged from the Great Keep, meeting Ned's gaze. "So soon?" she asked. He nodded. She sighed, accustomed to the demands of duty. Within a few days, the courtyard filled with the bustle of preparation. Wagons were loaded, retinues assembled, ravens sent to northern lords to inform them of the next steps. Ned spent each dawn in the Godswood, each dusk in the library tower, reminding Luwin and the scribes to continue their work on the records of the others in his absence. He left instructions for those lords who remained behind to maintain a heightened watch along the wall. He made a silent vow that he would never let King's Landing or the politics of the Iron Throne blind him to the greater threat again. Finally, on a crisp morning, the Stark party rode out through Winterfell's gates, Ned at the head, Robb by his side, a column of knights and attendants trailing behind. Catelyn would remain this time, overseeing the castle and younger children, though she planned to follow later with Sansa if the court demanded it. Ned, gazing northward before turning south, felt a pang. The wind carried a whisper, as if reminding him that his primary duty was here, in the land of snow and old gods. But the living realm also called him. He would not shirk that call. As the party trotted down the King's Road, the sun rose overhead, illuminating the path. Ned's thoughts drifted from memories of the vow to the uncertain future. On the horizon lay the capital, with its intrigues, potential war with Targaryens, and a king who once laughed at old ghost stories. That king had since learned better briefly, but men had short memories. Perhaps Ned could remind them of the North's lessons. Perhaps not. He only knew that so long as he drew breath, he would stand vigil against the creeping darkness beyond the known world. His father, Rickard, had taught him the meaning of duty. His brother, Brandon, had shown him fiery passion. Lyanna's memory haunted him with the costs of war. And the vow he had once borne for the Night King reminded him that the greatest tests of a man's honor might come not from mortal kings but from an evil as old as the wind. So he rode on, carrying that burden like a shield. If the day ever came again when the ice rose to engulf the living, Eddard Stark would be there, scarred but unbowed, a man who had tasted the chill of absolute night and found in himself the spark of defiance strong enough to break its hold. If there was any blessing in that horror, it was the fierce clarity it gave him. The living must protect each other, must remain united, or the dark would devour them all. He would carry that truth into whatever struggles awaited in King's Landing, and beyond, until his final day. For now, the horse beneath him carried him south, the drums of human politics echoing in the distance. But the memory of wind and ice was never far behind, a steady whisper in his mind that reminded him of what truly mattered. The realm of men must never again bow to the cold. The King's Road stretched ahead, dusty and sunlit. Birds darted among the treetops, the early summer air warm enough to make the horses snort. Robb asked a question about the politics of the capital, and Ned answered absently, his gaze shifting across the fields. The men behind them traded jokes, teased, or complained of the heat. Had any of them truly believed that, just a few short years ago, an army of the dead had marched on Winterfell? Some wore the scars to prove it. Others were too young, or had joined the ranks afterward, hearing only second-hand tales. They laughed or boasted about the glories of the city, about the feasts and the tournaments. But Ned Stark remembered, and in that memory he found a sense of quiet determination. He had once served the Night King, forced by a supernatural bond. He had broken free only at the last heartbeat. That brush with utter darkness had changed him, hardened him in some ways, and left him more empathetic in others. He understood how fragile men's illusions of safety were. And yet he also recognized that the smallest acts of bravery, of love, of loyalty, could thwart even an ancient evil. He thought of the final blow, the obsidian blade he'd driven into the Night King's chest, the punishing release of the vow. Something in him would always ache with that memory. Yet it was also proof that the living world had a power stronger than ice, a power forged in the hearts of those who refused to yield to despair. The caravan crested a small rise, revealing a long stretch of the road ahead. Ned spurred his horse gently, falling into an easy canter. The sun climbed higher, the heat growing. Sweat dampened his brow. His men joked about how the southern weather had arrived early, but Ned only half listened. He glanced over his shoulder northward one last time. He saw the distant lines of trees, the shape of the hills that led back to Winterfell, and in his mind's eye, he saw the swirling snow, the whites besieging the gates, the inhuman glow of the others. Then, superimposed on that nightmare, he saw Robb's determined face, the flash of obsidian weapons, the old crone's staff shining, and the resilience of men who refused to submit. He faced forward again, letting out a breath. The road led south into the realm's political storms. Yet the spirit of the North went with him. He was still the man who had bowed his head before Robert Baratheon in that rebellion, the man who had returned home with sorrow but had found love in his wife, the father who taught his children that winter is coming, so they must be strong. He was also the man who had knelt unwillingly before a being of ice, only to rise in defiance. The two halves of him merged into one, forging a steely resolve. Some days, he felt weary beyond his years, haunted by the knowledge that the battle might never truly end. But he pressed on, certain that so long as men like him remembered, the great other would find the realm a difficult foe. He had no illusions that it would be easy or guaranteed. Yet he carried hope like an ember in the cold. If the others should return in some distant tomorrow, they would meet not only stone walls and sharpened obsidian, but also the unbreakable spirit that had once cast them down. His horse's hooves thudded steadily on the packed earth. Robb rode close beside him, the next generation of the North's protectors. Behind them followed knights, squires, and men-at-arms, their banners rippling in the wind. The direwolf of House Stark, gray on a field of white, fluttered proudly above them, a symbol of the North's endurance. Ned lifted his gaze to that sigil, recalling the blood and tragedy bound to it, but also the unwavering sense of honor that the Starks had upheld for centuries. It was a heavy legacy, but he would bear it. He had carried a far heavier burden for the Night King's vow, and broken free. He would do so again for his people, 1,000 times if need be. The day moved on, and they rode under the bright sky. In Ned's mind, the swirl of wind and ice receded, replaced by the warm presence of his family and the knowledge that every day of sunshine was a victory of sorts. The darkness might come again, but when it did, the North would be ready. He had served that darkness once against his will. Never again. If the great other sought a foothold in Westeros, it would find no easy road. Eddard Stark had learned how to stand fast, and the realm, though often divided, had proven it could rally when the stakes were life and death. Perhaps that was the best hope they had. He closed his eyes briefly, felt the summer wind on his face, and then opened them to the wide world ahead. The caravan pressed onward, dust rising beneath the horses. Far behind them, Winterfell stood guard over the north, and far beyond that, the wall and its watchers kept vigil against silent wastes. And somewhere in the deeper corners of the wilderness, the echo of the Night King's presence lay dormant. But for today, for this hour, the living breathed freely, forging their stories under the sun. Ned tightened his grip on the reins and urged his horse forward, determined to face whatever trials lay beyond the next bend in the road, be they mortal politics or flickers of an ancient nightmare. For the moment he was free, his vow to the Night King shattered, his vow to the realm intact. And that, he reflected, was a triumph worth cherishing for as long as summer lasted.